She hadn't seen rain in weeks, but her shoes were still wet with regret. Boston was behind her, a world of lace lies and whispered pity, and ahead lay only dust, danger, and the promise of a man she'd never met. A man whose letters spoke of work, not love. Whose name, Silas Croft, was supposed to mean safety. But even now, staring out the cracked coach window at the red horizon bleeding into forever, Clara Hayes knew it. Safety was just another Eastern word that didn't survive out here. The journey west had stripped her clean. 17 days in a jolting stagecoach, each mile grinding away the polish of a city girl and leaving behind something leaner, rougher, something still breathing, but barely. The air grew drier with every sunrise, the passengers fewer, the silences longer. Boston had been all chatter and chandeliers. The desert was pure truth. It spoke in wind, in heat, in a kind of silence that made the heart confess its secrets. She held tight to the small bundle in her lap. 3 letters tied with twine, ink already faded from the touch of her anxious fingers. Letters that had promised partnership, not poetry. "We'll build something lasting," the man had written. No fancy verse, no flattery, just plain, deliberate words. Clara had read them again and again until she could almost hear his voice, low and steady, a man who worked the land and meant what he said. Now the wheels rattled to a stop outside a lonely trading post, little more than splintered boards and the smell of old whiskey. The driver called out, "End of the line!" and she stepped down into a furnace of sunlight. Red dust swallowed her boots. Men on the porch paused mid-laugh to stare, the kind of stare a woman could feel more than see. She squared her shoulders, forcing grace into shaking knees. A woman in a sweat-stained bonnet waved her inside. "Come, dear, out of that sun. You'll bake to death." The shade was a blessing. Cool, smelling of horses and smoke. Clara accepted a tin cup of water, sipping slow, careful not to spill. That was when she heard it. "Miss Hayes." The voice came from the doorway, low and sand-rough. She turned. A man stood there, broad-shouldered and sunburned, hat brim casting his eyes into shadow. He looked carved from the very land outside, weathered, honest, and dangerous in the quiet way storms are. "I'm Jed Fry," he said, nodding once. "Mr. Croft sent me to fetch you." Her heart gave a quick, foolish leap. Mr. Croft. The name she'd chased halfway across the country suddenly felt real. "You know him?" she asked, breathless. "Well enough," Jed replied, taking her valise as if it weighed nothing. "We'd best move. If luck's with us, we'll reach the homestead before dark." "Luck?" she echoed. He gave a small grin. "Outlaws sometimes ride these roads, but most steer clear of anyone under Taza's protection." She blinked. "Taza?" Jed's grin faded. "Best let the man himself tell you who that is." They climbed into the wagon. The world beyond the post unfolded wide and merciless, miles of cracked earth and gold air. The horses trotted steady, the sky a hard blue bowl above them. After a while, Jed said quietly, "The man you're going to meet, he ain't what you expect." Clara looked at him sharply. "Meaning?" He adjusted the reins, eyes on the horizon. "Meaning the name Silas Croft was a polite fiction. The man waiting for you out there, he's Apache. Through and through." For a long moment, all she could hear was the creak of leather and her own heart pounding. The land shimmered like fire ahead of them. And Clara Hayes, Boston girl, desperate dreamer, realized she might have just gambled her entire life on a lie. End scene. Call to action. If you're still with her, still wondering who waits beyond that burning ridge, don't blink now. The story's just catching fire. Subscribe, saddle up, and ride with us west into Part 2, The Rider and the Warning. The wagon creaked and rocked as it left the last splintered shadow of the trading post behind. Ahead lay nothing but endless sagebrush and sky, and the man beside her, Jed Fry, drove like he'd been born with dust in his blood and grit behind his teeth. Clara Hayes sat stiff-backed, hands folded tight in her lap. The letters in her satchel suddenly felt heavier than lead. Her thoughts spun with every clatter of the wheels. Silas Croft. That was the name she'd signed her future to. A man of steady handwriting, measured thoughts, and promises of partnership. But now? Jed had dropped that name like a snake in the road. Taza. One word, and everything shifted. The sun hung low in the west, gold leaking across the flats like spilled whiskey. A pair of hawks circled high above, their shadows swooping over the wagon seat. "You're awful quiet," Jed said finally, squinting into the light. "I'm thinking," Clara replied. Her voice was tight, but not weak. She wasn't bred for the West, but Boston society had taught her how to keep a mask on. Jed chuckled low. "Fair enough, but don't think too long. This land don't wait for nobody." She looked at him sideways. "Taza, that's his real name?" He nodded once, hands steady on the reins. "Born and raised Apache, tribe out of the southern high country. Son of Mangus, war chief once upon a time. Mother was named Nala. People say she had a voice like Riverstone, calm but unmovable." Clara blinked. "And the name Croft?" "Made up. Clean enough for white paper. Helps when you're writing to folks who'd run the other way if they saw who was holding the pen." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. She gripped the bench seat. "Why didn't he just say who he was?" Jed's eyes didn't leave the road. "Because he wanted you to know his heart first, not his bloodline. He figured a woman worth her salt would come for the man, not the name. And if I hadn't, then you'd be back on that stagecoach, headed east with dust in your teeth and nothing to show for it but a story nobody would believe." The horses trotted on. The heat shimmered off the plain in waves. "I'm not afraid," Clara said suddenly. Jed raised a brow. "Didn't say you were. But I might be foolish." Jed gave a dry laugh. "Darlin', foolish and brave are sometimes the same thing in these parts." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon cutting a path through the broken earth. Then Jed spoke again, softer this time. "There's something else you ought to know. Taza's name carries weight out here, not just with his kin, with outlaws too." Clara turned her head, wary. "Outlaws?" He nodded. "Most troublemakers steer wide of his land, but not all. There's a few bad seeds stirring lately. Don't like what he's building. They see peace between settlers and Apache as a threat. Say it makes men soft." Clara's stomach coiled. "Is it dangerous?" "Everything worth building is," Jed said. "But he ain't alone. His people respect him, settlers too. And from what I hear, he's been waiting on you with more than hope in his chest." She didn't know what that meant. Not fully. But she held on to it like a lifeline as the wagon crested a ridge. And then, just like that, she saw it. The land dropped into a wide basin, and nestled at the base of red rock cliffs was a ranch that looked like it had grown straight out of the earth. Adobe walls, barns, long fences, smoke curling from chimneys. And in front of the main house, a man. Not Silas Croft, not a name on paper, a barefoot Apache, tall and still, with eyes like night and a presence that pulled at her like gravity. Jed pulled the reins. "That's him," he said. And Clara Hayes knew. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the edge of something far bigger. The wagon creaked to a halt on the ridgeline, the sun bleeding red across the sky like an open wound. Clara Hayes sat frozen, staring down into the basin below. It wasn't the ranch that took her breath. It was the man in front of it. He stood still as stone, a silhouette carved against the glow, barefoot on the dusty ground, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm that didn't come from gentleness, but from knowing exactly who he was. The leather vest across his chest fluttered in the wind, beadwork catching fire in the sunset. Reds, whites, blues threaded into meaning she didn't yet understand. Turquoise hung at his throat, not for show, but for heritage. For truth. His hair was long, braided with feathers and silver, the kind of silver not bought from a Boston shop, but passed down, earned. And when the wind stirred, it moved with him like it knew his name. Clara felt her heart stumble. That wasn't Silas Croft. That man, whoever he was, belonged to the desert. Jed Fry cleared his throat and said, almost reverently, "That's him. That's Taza." The man who'd written those letters. The man who had waited. The man who had not been honest about his name. But maybe had told more truth than any man Clara had ever known. She stepped down onto the hot earth, her boots sinking just enough to feel the weight of it. Her skirts clung to her calves, heavy with dust and sweat. Her bonnet hung limp down her back. Nothing about her felt proper anymore. Not her dress, not her thoughts, and certainly not her heart. Taza didn't move. Not at first. He let her come closer, let her see him plain, without explanation. When he did step forward, it was with the slow grace of a mountain lion, measured, fluid, and completely unbothered by uncertainty. Clara's throat tightened as he stopped in front of her. His eyes, dark and deep as canyon shadow, met hers without flinching. There was no apology in his face, but there was honesty, a kind of heavy, quiet integrity that made lesser men look like boys playing dress-up. He said her name like it was a secret only he'd been trusted with. Clara Hayes. She blinked, stunned by how her name sounded in his voice, roughened by wind, shaped by two languages, and yet spoken more clearly than she'd ever heard it. "You're not Silas Croft," she managed, her voice brittle from days of heat and doubt. "No," he said simply. "Silas Croft was who I needed to be. So you'd come this far." He took a step closer. He was the bridge, but I am the man. "Taza," she repeated, trying the name like it might burn her tongue. He nodded, unashamed. "Taza is who I am." They stood in the full hush of the evening, the desert wrapped around them like a witness. Behind her, Jed busied himself with the horses, deliberately giving them space. Clara had been raised to expect a man in a waistcoat, with clean boots and polished manners. But this man, he was wilderness and resolve. His presence filled the space between them, not with charm, but with purpose. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Taza's answer was just as quiet. "Only what you came here hoping to find. A place to stand, a reason to stay." He turned then, not waiting for her to follow, just trusting that if she wanted the truth, she'd walk into it. And she did. The house was nothing like she expected. Thick adobe walls, timber beams overhead, and a hush that came not from wealth, but from work. It wasn't grand. It was grounded. Hand-woven rugs softened the wood floors, and Apache beadwork adorned the walls alongside settler lanterns. Cultures stitched together. Not for show, but because they lived that way. Taza led her upstairs, silent except for the creak of the boards beneath her boots. His own feet made no sound at all. Clara felt like a ghost trailing behind something solid, something real. He stopped at the last door on the hall. "This is yours," he said. She stepped inside. It was beautiful. Not ornate, not polished, but considered. A bed with clean linens, a small writing desk near a window facing the mountains, a wardrobe with a few dresses already hung inside, practical ones, like hers, but hand-finished with skill. Someone had thought about her. Taza leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "Sadie arranged it. She runs the house. You tell her if anything don't sit right, she'll see it fixed." Clara turned to him. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. Questions, doubts, curiosity that burned hotter than fear. "I don't understand," she said. "Your letters were honest, except for your name. But this whole place—" "Why me?" He looked at her for a long time, and when he spoke, it wasn't with charm, but with the same level tone as always, steady, like rain on a tin roof. "Because you wrote like a woman looking for something more than safety," he said. "You didn't pretend to be rich or desperate or anything you're not. You spoke plain. I figured if you could do that in a letter, maybe you'd do it in life too." She stepped closer, emboldened by the steadiness in his voice. "And what do you expect of me, as your wife?" Taza didn't flinch. "Respect, honesty, work." He glanced out the window for a breath, then back at her. "This ain't a place for ornaments. I don't want a woman to follow me around in silence. I want a partner, someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, someone who can live between our worlds without losing herself. And if I can't," his voice softened, "then I'll help you find the road home. No shame in that, but I won't chain a woman here who don't want to stay." The silence that followed held more weight than any vow she'd ever heard in church. "I'm not afraid," she said, almost to herself. "You don't have to decide tonight." He moved to leave, then paused at the door. "You get to choose, and I'll honor it, whatever it is." She watched him go, her chest full of 100 tangled things: relief, tension, wonder, and something she wasn't ready to name. In Boston, she'd never had a choice. Not really. Society had told her where to sit, how to smile, who to marry. Here, this stranger, this Apache man, had given her something no one ever had: a room of her own, a view of the mountains, a future not dictated, but offered. As the sun dropped behind the ridge and the last light spilled across her floor, Clara Hayes sat on the edge of her new bed and breathed for the first time in a long while. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this much. This time, the choosing was hers. The next morning broke clean and gold, a kind of quiet that only comes after a decision's been made, even if no words were spoken. Clara dressed in a cotton work dress, one she'd chosen herself from the few hanging in the wardrobe. No corset, no gloves, just fabric and breath and the feel of her boots hitting real earth. Taza was already waiting by the barn, sleeves rolled, a mug of coffee in one hand and a rope coil in the other. He didn't smile, but he tipped his head, and somehow that meant more. "Thought I'd show you the place," he said simply. "All of it." Clara followed him across the yard, past rows of vegetables and chicken coops, the scent of earth still damp from an early morning soak. This wasn't just a ranch. It was a system, a rhythm, and every step made her realize how much she hadn't seen the day before. Taza moved like a man connected to the land, not just walking it, but reading it. His eyes scanned fence lines, animals, clouds. He introduced her to every hand they passed. "This is Eli. You need a saddle fixed. He's your man. That's Ruth. She oversees the kitchen garden. These boys here handle the goats. And trouble, sometimes." The workers didn't just nod out of duty. They looked at Clara, really looked at her, and while some of their eyes were cautious, none of them were cold. Then he led her to the schoolhouse, small, adobe-built, with wide windows and the sound of laughter spilling out like light. Inside, a young man with sandy hair stood at a chalkboard, teaching English letters to a room of both settler and Apache children. The students sat shoulder to shoulder, braids beside bonnets. "That's Seth Gable," Taza said low. "Taught back east a while. Came here 'cause he believes what we're doing matters. We teach both ways. Language, history, medicine. No side gets to rewrite the story here." Clara watched a girl in buckskin raise her hand to correct the boy beside her in perfect English. The boy just nodded, grinning. "You built this?" she asked, stunned. "No," Taza said, looking through the window. "We did." They walked the rest of the ranch in silence. Horses, tools, grain stores. Every detail had intention. Efficiency, yes, but something gentler underneath. By midday, he brought her back to the house. They sat beneath the cottonwoods where the shade was thick and the breeze carried the scent of mesquite and horses. "This place," she said finally, "it's not just land. It's a conversation." Taza turned to her, eyes steady. "Exactly. Took 5 years to get folks to stop shouting and start listening. It's still fragile." She met his gaze. "Then why bring me into it?" He shrugged. "Because it won't hold without women who can live between both sides. I don't need someone to finish the story. I need someone willing to write the next page." Clara sat back, heart full and rattled all at once, not with fear, but with a strange, sharp sense of belonging. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to fit in. She was standing at the center of something brave. And she wasn't just witnessing it, she was part of it. Late that afternoon, with the sky burned pale blue and the sun drawing long shadows across the yard, Taza asked if she'd walk with him. No horses, no ranch hands, just the two of them and the sound of wind dragging across dry grass. They climbed a narrow trail behind the house, the kind worn in by footsteps over years, not wagons or livestock. High mesquite trees leaned overhead, and the rocks underfoot were sun-warmed and unsteady. Clara didn't ask where they were headed. She didn't need to. At the top of the ridge, the land opened wide. Below them, the ranch spread out like a stitched quilt of pasture and fencing. Further out, nothing but open desert and purple-bellied mountains. "This is where I come when I need to think," Taza said, settling onto a flat rock. His voice had a different weight up here. Softer, less guarded. Clara sat beside him, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her cheek, her heart pacing. "What do you think about?" He was quiet a long moment before answering. "What I've built. What it cost." He glanced at her, and what it still might. She waited. Something in her knew better than to fill silence with idle chatter. The wind carried dust and memory alike, and when he spoke again, it was like the words had been waiting years to leave his chest. "My father, Mangus, was a war leader," Taza said, "feared by settlers, respected by our people, but he saw where all the blood was leading. When I was 8, he sent me east, to be educated by the same world that called him a savage." Clara turned toward him slowly, the story wrapping around her like rawhide. "I lived in Philadelphia," he continued. "Boston for a time, too. Learned how to sit straight, talk soft, read law. Learned how to keep my eyes down so men didn't see me as a threat. And every time I passed someone on the street who flinched, or spit, or crossed themselves, I remembered what I was to them." He turned his hands palm up, as if weighing something invisible. "You learn quick that education don't scrub skin, or blood?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "My father, Orion Hayes. He would have never allowed this. Me, I mean. This life. Taza looked at her, steady and clear. I knew his name. I knew he was one of the men who pushed the bill to block Apache land rights. The East called it progress. We called it theft. Clara lowered her eyes, heat prickling behind them. He taught me not to trust anything that didn't come in a prayer book or a bank ledger. I've spent years trying to unlearn what he carved into me. You're not your father, Taza said, and I'm not the man they painted on their wanted posters. He reached into the pouch at his side and pulled out a small framed image, a painting, worn and creased at the edges. A woman. Strong face. Beaded collar. Eyes like his. My mother, Nala, he said quietly. She's the reason I wrote to you, because when I read your letters, I heard her voice in them. Clara took the picture carefully, running her fingers over the faded lines. She's beautiful. She was more than that, Taza said. She had a gift. She saw people for what they were, not what others claimed they ought to be. Clara looked out over the land again, the horizon glowing like fire beneath the setting sun. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And what do you see when you look at me? Taza didn't hesitate. A woman trying to find her own truth, same as me. And in that moment, up on that ridge where two pasts collided, Clara knew. They weren't running from who they were. They were walking straight into what they could become. Clara stood in the center of a clearing lit by morning sun, her heart thundering like hooves across hardpan. The scent of burning sage hung in the air, mingling with smoke from 4 sacred fires staked at each corner of the gathering. It was nothing like the weddings she'd seen in Boston. No lace, no piano, no church bells. And yet, it felt more real than anything she'd ever known. Her dress, made of soft buckskin, had been crafted by the women of Taza's people. Cream-colored, embroidered with rows of turquoise, red, and white beads that shimmered with every breath she took. Silver conchos lined the hem, each one sewn with purpose. Every bead, every stitch, whispered of protection, of unity, of legacy. Sadie had helped her dress at dawn, her hands firm and reverent. This isn't just for show, she'd said. This dress carries the prayers of the women who came before you. Wear it like armor. Now, Clara stood beneath the open sky beside the man who had rewritten the shape of her life. Taza looked like he belonged to the land, dressed in formal regalia, leather leggings, a beaded vest, feathers braided into his dark hair. But it wasn't just the clothes. It was his bearing. Quiet, powerful, unshakable. And still, when he looked at her, there was softness in his eyes. Isha, the eldest of the clan and Taza's grandmother, sat at the center of the circle. No one questioned her presence. She was the kind of woman folks stepped aside for, not out of fear, but deep-boned respect. She hadn't left her mountain in 5 years. She came today for this. When Aisha spoke, her voice was smoke and gravel, laced with the weight of generations. Her words flowed in Apache first, strong and lyrical, and then in English. May their love be as steady as the mountains, as flowing as the rivers, as constant as the sun. May they build a family rooted in peace. She bound their hands together with a braided cord, her fingers rough and warm. Then she placed her hand over Clara's chest, eyes fierce as firelight. You walked far from everything you knew, Aisha said, but now you are here. You are not outsider, you are wife. The word hit Clara like a bell ringing clear through canyon walls. Wife, not property, not decoration, not a piece of a man's estate, a partner. As the final blessing faded into the circle, voices rose, not hymns, but songs carried from the old tongue, layered with drums, cedar smoke, and desert wind. Clara barely noticed the tears slipping down her cheeks. Later, at the celebration, she was swept into a whirlwind of handshakes, laughter, and offerings. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, beaded bracelets, blessings whispered into her ear by strangers who no longer saw her as one. She felt their eyes measuring her, not with suspicion, but with hope. Could she carry what this place asked of her? And when Taza introduced her as his wife, his voice didn't boom or boast. It was quiet, proud. Sure, the fire in her chest burned brighter. They danced that night, Apache rhythm layered with settler strings. Taza took her hand, pulled her close, and they moved slow, steady, grounded. "You did well," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. Clara looked up into his face and smiled. Not the polite kind she'd mastered back east, but a full, honest smile from someplace deep inside. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That's why I chose you." And in the glow of the fire, bound by hands and spirit and everything unspoken, Clara Hayes understood. She hadn't just joined a life. She'd chosen one. Night settled over the desert like a prayer. Stars spilled across the sky in a way you couldn't see back east. No gaslight, no rooftops, just God's own lanterns blinking wide and true. The wedding fires had burned low, and laughter still drifted through the cottonwoods, but Taza took Clara's hand and led her away. They walked in silence, the kind that didn't ask for words. Just breath and footsteps, and the way his thumb brushed hers like a promise. The trail wound between sandstone outcroppings, where wild sage grew thick, and the earth held the memory of fire and rain. Finally, they reached a narrow canyon where the air shifted. Cooler, quieter. Taza stopped. Before them lay a spring. Clear as glass, it bubbled from the rock, untouched and ancient. Moonlight shimmered across its surface, and the air smelled of damp stone, wild mint, and something deeper, like the breath of the land itself. "This place," Taza said softly, "is sacred." Clara stepped forward, drawn by the stillness. "It's beautiful." "It never runs dry," he said, "even in the worst drought. My people say it carries the spirit of the earth, life that doesn't bow to men or fire or time." He crouched by the edge of the spring, running his fingers through the water. "I come here to remember who I am. Not the letters, not the rancher, not the man people expect, just me." Clara knelt beside him. The air felt thick, not heavy, but alive. She dipped her fingers into the pool. It was cold, crisp, grounding. Taza turned to her, his voice low but steady. "I wanted you to see it. Because what we have, it's not just about building a home. It's about honoring something older, this land, this bond. It matters." She looked up at him, her voice a whisper. "And you trust me with it?" "With everything," he said. The moment hung suspended, moonlight, water, and something fragile blooming between them. Clara leaned forward, and for the first time since that dusty coach ride from Boston, she didn't feel like a stranger in her own skin. Their kiss wasn't hurried. It wasn't hesitant either. It felt like stepping into fire and finding it didn't burn. It warmed, rooted, fierce, real. But before the heat of it could settle into peace, a shadow moved behind them. Aisha. She stood just beyond the spring's edge, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her eyes held no malice, but they were grave, searching. Taza stood, pulling Clara gently to her feet. "Grandmother," he greeted with quiet respect. Isha's gaze flicked between them. Then she stepped forward, resting a weathered hand on Taza's chest. You built something strong, she said. But strength draws enemies. There are men gathering, ones who see this ranch not as peace, but as threat. Taza's jaw clenched. Settlers? Settlers, raiders, some from both bloodlines, Aisha said. Men who fear what doesn't fit into their old stories. Clara felt her gut twist. When? Soon, Isha answered. The smoke has started rising. The wind carries it. I can smell it. She reached out and took Clara's hand. Her grip was firmer than expected, eyes dark and sharp. Love is not the end, Isha said. It's the beginning. Now comes the fire that tests it. She turned and walked into the night, her silhouette swallowed by shadow. Taza didn't speak. He just held Clara tighter, and in the sacred hush by the spring, they both knew, whatever peace they'd carved out under this sky, they'd have to fight to keep it. The wind had changed. Taza felt it in his bones before he saw the dust rising beyond the ridge. A dry wind, sharp and restless, the kind that made livestock nervous and sent old men looking to the sky. But it wasn't the weather turning. It was men. Clara was in the barn, helping Sadie stack bundles of dried herbs when he stepped inside. She looked up, brushing hair from her brow. They're close, aren't they? Taza nodded. Riders, maybe 5, maybe more, coming from the North Trail. Sadie straightened, her face tight with worry. You want me to get the others inside? Not yet, he said. Not until we know what they're here for. But they all knew. By sundown, the riders crested the ridge like a bad memory. Dusty, armed, hard-eyed. Men Clara didn't know, but Taza did. One of them was Boyd Laramie, a bitter ex-rancher who'd once tried to lay claim to a water line cutting through Apache land. The courts ruled him off, but he never let go of the grudge. He came with his own kind. White men with rusted spurs and Apache turncoats alike. Traitors who'd sold out their own for coin. They rode up bold, like the land already belonged to them. Taza met them at the gate, shoulders squared, hands empty but his stance ready. Clara stood a few paces behind, her hands hidden in her skirt folds, clutching the grip of her father's revolver. Evening, Boyd called, dismounting with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Fine piece of land you got here. Heard you were building something. New. Taza didn't flinch. You're not welcome here. That's so. Boyd glanced around, taking in the barns, the cattle, the fence lines straight as scripture. You think planting a white woman in your bed makes this ranch yours? Clara stepped forward before she thought better of it. I'm his wife. This is our land, and you'll turn around before you find out what it costs to cross us. Boyd laughed, a dry, bitter sound. That's cute. You got grit, I'll give you that. But it don't change what's coming. This patch of desert, it's oil now. I got men in Prescott who'd pay good money for a slice. Taza's voice was steady, lethal. We don't sell what's sacred. Boyd's grin turned to a sneer. Then you'll bleed for it. And just like that, it began. The first shot cracked the silence. Sadie dragged Clara behind the feed trough as bullets tore through the yard. Horses screamed. Someone shouted in Apache. Smoke rose where the barn caught fire. Taza dropped 2 riders with clean, brutal shots, moving like the wind, controlled, furious. One of Boyd's men tackled him near the water trough, fists flying, and the 2 men hit the dirt in a blur of limbs and blood. Clara fired twice, the gun kicking hard in her hands. One rider dropped. Another fled. Sadie had a shotgun and grit, keeping them from circling. And then, quiet. Not peace, just the kind of stillness that comes after fire. Boyd was gone, left a trail of blood and hoofprints behind. They'd won, but barely. The barn smoldered, and 2 good men lay dead. Clara ran to Taza, wiping blood from his temple. He caught her hand, held it like it was the last good thing in the world. "You still want this?" he asked, breath ragged. She nodded. "Especially now." Because love was easy in peace, but in fire, it was forged. The fire didn't take everything. They rebuilt slow, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The barn's charred bones were cleared, the fields replanted. What couldn't be salvaged was buried, and what could be shaped into something new was shaped by hand. Taza's calloused palms, Clara's patient touch, Sadie's quiet resolve. Summer came, then cooled into a dry and golden fall. The air smelled of cedar and cracked leather, smoke and sweat. In the distance, mountains stood like old gods, watching everything unfold with the kind of stillness that didn't need words. Clara stood barefoot on the porch, the boards warm beneath her feet. Her skirt fluttered in the breeze, hands resting on the swell of her belly. She was heavier now, slower, but her gaze was as sharp as it had ever been, unyielding, unwavering. Taza came up from the fields, his hat tipped back, shirt clinging with the day's labor. He still limped from the bullet he'd taken that night Boyd attacked, but he wore the pain like an old song, familiar, even comforting. "You planted early," she said. He smiled faintly. "Rain's coming. I can feel it." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "You always say that." "And I'm always right." He reached the steps and rested one hand on the railing, looking out at what they'd built, what they'd kept. The land stretched out before them, raw and hard-earned. Not just a ranch, not just a place. It was memory now, bone deep, paid for in blood, but sealed in love. Taza took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and looked up at her with a quiet, soulful softness that didn't need poetry to be understood. "Do you ever miss what came before?" she asked. "Before all this?" He was quiet a long time. Then, "Sometimes, but only in pieces. I don't miss being alone. I don't miss silence that meant loss. And I sure don't miss trying to belong to a world that never wanted me." Clara stepped down to him, placed her hand against his chest. "You belong here. Not because I say so, because you made it so." They stood like that until the wind changed. It always did. Later, Sadie joined them for supper. She brought honey bread and stories, and they laughed, even when the lanterns flickered and coyotes sang from the ridge. After dark, when the house had gone still, Clara lay beside Taza, their hands folded over her belly. "You think they'll be safe?" she whispered. "Our child?" he asked. "Not always, but safer than we were, and stronger too." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of rain and sage and long memory. Taza closed his eyes and breathed deep. Not just a survivor, not just a fighter, a father, a husband, a keeper of land that had outlasted empires. And so the dust settles, for now. But tell me, folks, if everything you loved was taken, would you fight to rebuild it? Or would you let the wind carry it away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because out here, every voice echoes longer than you think.